talked about earlier, they don't talk.
Okay.
So it's kind of like,
but they probably have an order of how they coexist.
not when you're a solitary bee.
Okay.
They're gregarious, meaning they'll live next door to one another,
Okay.
right? But they actually won't talk. So it's kind of like when you lived in an apartment complex.
Right.
You knew you had a neighbor.
Yeah.
Did you really talk with them a lot? No.
Right.
You know, but you knew you lived next door.
Yeah.
So the solitary bees are the same way.
Very cool.
So I thought that it would be good. So that's a honeybee. See, this white stuff, this is all a cover crop. So these are Perdovic sunflowers, and then you have the lemon queens that are the taller ones.
Mm-hmm.
But the sunflowers that you get at the farm stands, a lot of times they plant the cultivar Soraya, and that cultivar doesn't have any pollen, and so it doesn't fall out onto your dining room table, kind of thing. But you really want to get flowers, plant flowers that have both pollen and nectar, right? And so because the pollen is their protein source, the nectar is their carbohydrate source.
Okay.
So we talked about before how honeybees and bumblebees make honey.
Yeah.
Well, the other bees, like leafcutters and mason bees, they live such a short amount of time, it doesn't make sense for them to make honey. So instead they just eat straight wildflower nectar all the time.
Okay.
So
how would an average person know if their flowers have pollen?
I would say if you want to plant sunflowers, plant lemon queens. That is the best
Those are
sunflower.
the lemon queens.
Yep,
popping
yep,
up
the
there.
tall ones. That's kind of fun to see how big they'll get,
Yeah.
right? And you can even see in the distance that there's
But
some
can you
bumblebees
see
on
the
them.
can you see the pollen?
Yeah. So.
Okay, so that what's falling off?
Yeah. So the orangey stuff.
Okay.
This doesn't have. So see on that leaf?
Yeah.
That's all pollen.
Got it.
So that's protein, right?
Okay.
But yeah, so it's kind of cool that the bees. Oh, there's a honeybee. What are you doing? Right, you can go back to the flower. So yeah, I mean there's.
And do most flowers have nectar? I feel like this is something I should know from
Yes.
grade school.
Well, no, it's a very good question actually. The only reason why flowers produce nectar is they are attracting the pollinators to them, right? Because they want to move their pollen, which is sperm. It's all about plant sex actually, right? Because you want to get your pollen to another flower and to fertilize it and make seeds, right? So the only way to attract a bee or a wasp or a yellow jacket, since they're all pollinators, is just that bees are better because they're furrier. If you're furry, then you're a better pollinator than if you're not as furry. So this one girl said to me, so my cat, if it had wings, it would be a good pollinator. I said, yes, exactly. So again, the only reason why flowers produce nectar is to attract a bee, right? Then when it moves to the next flower, it pollinates it. Once that other flower, right, is pollinated, the flower immediately knows it and it stops producing nectar and starts absorbing the nectar again because it's so energy intensive for them to make. So bumblebees know this somehow. So when they actually do their food collection trips, before they go home, they go to each flower that they visited 2 or 3 times because they know that they just pollinated that flower. It's going to stop. How they know this, I don't know, but through science they found this. So they'll visit that flower 2 to 3 times before they actually go home and unload the food, because they know that that flower, as soon as it's pollinated, is absorbing the rest, and they want to get as much as they possibly can.
Wow.
Crazy, right?
Amazing.
So grapes, wine grapes, are actually self-pollinating. So those flowers don't even produce any nectar because they don't need a bee.
Mm-hmm.
So there's no energetic reason why it would produce nectar.
Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah. Our lives are so busy
Yeah.
that there's only so much you can focus on,
Right.
right? So thank goodness with your book, everything's right there, so people don't have to start from square one where you did before you wrote it. But people are just too busy to know.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm happy that we came out with the sizer, because it shows that the mason bees made it. And hopefully by people planting flowers, they'll see all the different kinds of bees, and then they'll start getting into it too. So that's why the lemon queens, to me, the lemon queen sunflowers are really that like gateway flower to planting even more in your backyard and taking more bees to lunch.
So I read about the colony collapse disorder, which was the population decrease of, and I'm not sure if that focused on honeybees. But so I'm wondering if, in your opinion, that has improved. But second, it seems like the pollination crisis is maybe a separate issue.
Right. So first, let's talk about the pollination crisis, and then remind me about CCD. So, because I go off on tangents, but before World War II, farmers really would farm a bunch of different crops, right? And they would have some natural areas set aside, hedgerows set aside, where the native bees would live. Remember, 70% of them live in the ground, and then 30% of them live in bee tunnels. So, you know, over 300 different species of bees live in the ground. Those native bees, because they're 2 to 3 times better at pollinating than honeybees, they were the ones that pollinated all the crops. But then what happened was, after World War II, with the advent of chemical fertilizers and factory farms, where everybody's, not everybody, but many farms started focusing just on one crop, right, and specializing, they would then farm acres of just one crop and till under everything, right? So then you started seeing how there was a decrease in natural lands, and they just had one crop. Each crop only blooms for about a week, week and a half. So if you were just having that 1 week and a half, right, now all of a sudden you have to bring in pollinators because you're not feeding them through the season, and you got rid of their habitat.
Right.
So a bumblebee, like I said, can only fly half mile on average, right? Whereas a mason bee only flies 300 feet, or a football field. Honeybees, on the other hand, they'll fly up to 3 miles. So even though they're not as good at pollinating, they can fly longer distances. So then you can call a beekeeper and say, hey, bring your hives over. I've got a crop. They bring them in for 2 weeks and they take them away, and then you have factory farms. So the pollination crisis that people are talking about is really because honeybees started having such a difficult time. And you really only hear about honeybees because that's where all the data is. Because you have beekeepers that are keeping honeybees, non-native honeybees, because they're all originally from Europe. But they keep the bees because people like honey, and so they know how many of their hives died off during the winter, right? Or during the year, because you have real data. With the native bees, because they fly so quickly and live all these different crazy, oh look, there's a monarch butterfly. That cracks me up. So because native bees live all over the place, and we're still in some areas even identifying what those species are. Some of them don't even have common names, some even scientific names, right? So there isn't as much baseline data on those native bees. So there actually is a decline with those native bees, but you just hear about the honeybees because there's more data there, and people love honey so much. So, but colony collapse disorder, in my definition, there are a few different definitions of CCD, but to me it's a death by 1,000 cuts, right? You have pesticides that are an issue, land use changes, viruses, pesticides. So with the pesticides, right? A big one are the class of pesticides called neonicotinoids, or neonics for short. It's giving, for instance, you know, the grub killers, not nematodes because that's a natural way of getting rid of grubs, but when you have dead spots in your lawn, sometimes it's caused by grubs. Some people will then take a pesticide, sprinkle it down on the lawn, and then irrigate it in. The grubs come eat the lawn roots, they die, right? Which is what the goal was. But the problem is that active ingredient, imidacloprid, is usually the main ingredient, or clothianidin is another neonic. It still goes into the plants, but it goes into the leaves, and from the roots into the leaves, and then the nectar and pollen. The bees come, take that back, they eat it, take it back to their home, and through time, they're getting early dementia.
Yeah, oh wow.
You know, and journal article upon journal article is showing this. It's not just some kind of fluffy idea. I mean, there's like real science behind it that this is a real issue. And then on top of it, you have land use changes, right? Everybody likes these green lawns with nothing growing there,
Right.
you know, and look, you can reverse that trend so easily.
Right.
But folks seem to like these green lawns with nothing growing in them, and that's a food desert to a bee, so then you're hurting them that way. And then even high deer populations, which we definitely have on the East End, they're eating all of the flowers.
Okay.
So again, affecting all the deer populations.
Okay.
And also understory bird populations as well have declined because of the high populations of deer. When you go hiking through a forest now on the East End, you can see right through the forest. There's not as much understory because the deer have eaten it.
Okay.
So it's definitely affected the ecosystem even more on a broader scale out here than even climate change has at this point on our forests. So you'll see, and I know this is a tangent with the deer, but you'll see more non-native invasive species in a forest now because the deer don't like to eat it.
Okay.
So they preferentially eat the native species, which they co-evolved with, and that's why you have tons of wineberry and other invasives, a mile-a-minute vine, everything just growing there. And yeah, it's just not good. So
I've also read that farmers, because there isn't enough natural flowers for the bees to, for the bees' natural diet, that farmers have had to give them high fructose corn syrup. Have you heard that?
So farmers can change that trend, right? High fructose corn syrup, some of the larger farmers or beekeepers give that to their bees because it's a cheaper source in the spring to get them going. You can just use regular sugar water, right? But the best of all is giving them their honey or keeping honey on their hive. So with the best thing that farmers can do is actually having a natural area for the bees to live.